All right, in my last lecture, we looked at Andrew Marvell's poem, The Garden, and we looked at it in the light of the genre of pastoral poetry, a long-standing mode of poetry existing from the time of Theocritus in the Greek tradition to certainly Virgil in the Latin tradition, the two probably most famous exponents of this genre. It's a genre, though, that is wildly popular in certain ages, certainly was so in the 16th century, and remains so all the way certainly through the Romantic period, with significant differences there, largely because of the different view taken on what nature was and the right relation of human culture to nature. And this is one of the great themes of any study of not just poetry, but of Western thought, is the right relation of nature to culture. And it's certainly the case that in our day, it's a great challenge, as it always has been, for Christians to address this topic, largely because they have a bifurcated notion of what truth will, and biblical truth specifically, will relate to. And so while some will say that the Bible speaks truth, I mean, some will deny truth altogether on any subject matter, but those that will uphold the truth of Scripture will nonetheless restrict its truth to certain religious propositions and religious claims, and say that this is what we speak to, and this is what the Bible speaks to, and what the Christian worldview speaks to, but it does not speak authoritatively to other things. So it rejects the idea that Nancy Pearcey advances in her book, Total Truth, upholds, which is that the Bible does actually speak to other matters, and that there is no truth that is not God's truth. And so all areas that are related to truth are going to relate of necessity to other forms of truth, because truth is an unbroken thing and united to truth in some fashion. So we can't have two magisteria which are at odds with one another. There has to be some sort of form of unity there. Now, you may wonder why I mention that. It's certainly a theme of great interest to me, and those of you who've studied with me on various courses know that the concern about trans and post-humanism is a real one for me, and I deal with that in my sci-fi and subcreation course, among others, because in those works, dealt with in the science fiction genre in particular, science is being used over nature, and not over just the world, which we often refer to as nature, but also human nature, and is used to express some sort of dominance over it. And it does so in a way that many people in our day are increasingly questioning, and has become very much a part of the environmentalist movement, for instance. And that's because Bacon's view of nature suggests that nature is something along the lines of a slave. This is the language that he uses of nature, that is there to be put in constraint and molded by mankind to his uses. And this is concurrent, or is contemporaneous, with Andrew Marvell. Remember, we began the course with a look at some of Bacon's shorter essays, and we can see that and I think that this is specifically what Marvell is engaging with here in these poems, these so-called Mower poems. Now, I started with the poem on gardens, rather on the garden, because I thought it was a useful beginning to it. But there's also a series of poems that are related to each other. At least scholars think that they are, and they come in an order. The first is the Mower against gardens. The second is Damon the Mower, the third the Mower to glowworms, and then finally the Mower's song. I'm going to address the first and the last in that sequence, although on the syllabus we've only got the Mower's song as the required reading. I want to address the first and the last of them, because I think there's a consistent worldview presented in the four poems that are questioning the view of nature that is being presented by Francis Bacon, and specifically the way in which nature is being seen in an instrumental fashion. in which the natural order of things is being effectively desecrated, that is being dissociated from having any sanctity, and can be used for the purposes of advancing material wealth, the domination over nature, and as I say, the sorts of things that the environmental movement in our day expresses most strongly, and also are to be found to a lesser extent, although in similar sorts of tones, in the Romantic movement. And so Marvell is, as somebody who was brought in the puritanical tradition, although he is opposed to the decorousness of Catholicism, and so he is opposed to churches and altars and church windows and excessive orderliness in worship. Nonetheless, he is upholding the transcendence or the sanctity of nature. And to some degree, he sees the immanence of God's hand in the created order. And that immanence of God's goodness in the created order is at odds with Bacon's understanding that nature is just simply a slave there to be utilized without any concern for the well-being of the slave, in this case, the slave being the natural order. And so in these poems, he is directly addressing this. And the mower, of course, is a figure that replaces then the gardener. The mower being a mechanical instrument that is used to cut the grass. So he sets this up in these poems, and he, as I say, there's a continuity that comes between them. I'm not going to handle them all, but I'll deal with the first and the last in the sequence, and then try and illustrate that for you. But if you want works by Bacon that speak to this, he does write an essay. We didn't look at it, but a short essay on gardens, and also one called Silva Silvarum, in which he talks about the best ways to garden and how to manipulate flowers and fruits for better products. So it's the cultural mandate, as it were, Genesis 1, 27, 28, to be fruitful, multiply, and fill and subdue the earth. Well, what do we mean by subdue the earth? Bacon takes it in the absolutist sense of bring it under domination, without any concern for its original design, its original purpose, its original sanctity, and so forth. We're going to find that Marvell, although he is not a romantic, is very much objecting to this instrumental notion of nature without any notion of an appeal to the creator's intentions in design and the purpose of creation, and how creation itself is something that we are to be stewards over and not masters of. So these are issues that arise out of the poem. Let me turn to those poems. But as I say, we mustn't view Marvell, and I said this in the lecture, and I reiterated it in class. We have to contextualize Marvell in the light of his period. He is a product of the late Renaissance, but he's also a Puritan. He regards the creation as a perfect work of God's handiwork, and God's glory and his goodness can be seen in his work, and it is not to be understood outside and without relation to the creator. So we can't just look at the creation, which is what the Romantic poets tend to do. They look at, they object to the instrumentality of nature, and yet they don't actually consider the creator of nature. Where did nature come from, and so forth. They set aside those questions, and also the purpose of nature. They set aside those, and they are very man-centered, as it were, and instrumental in their views of it. They simply object to the limitation of instrumentality by Bacon, but they don't actually object to the instrumental approach per se. They think it ought to be, the instrument ought to be used to reflect on human glory, but never to reflect on God's glory. And so this is a significant difference there. And so the pastoral genre is perfect for Marvell's Christian religious purposes of critiquing what Bacon and his view of science and its intentions is happening, which is that we are effectively, even while being something like gardeners, we are corrupting the created order and committing sin against God and, of course, against the creation itself. So the first poem we're going to look at is The Mower Against Gardens. And we're going to find that in many ways that they are very similar to the poem The Garden, because in both poems, the speakers condemn men who obsess over the material world and mistake the significance. And as I said to you, they can't see the forest for the trees. They see the individual or the garlands or whatever. They see a piece of nature, but they don't see it in the light of its whole. And so in the garden, we see that already, how vainly men themselves amaze to win the palm, the oak or bays, and their incessant labor see crowned from some single herb or tree. And so there's a loss of perspective that he's critiquing there. And these are vain endeavors, and this is the misuse of nature. Even in the midst of nature, it's not seeing nature in the way nature ought to be seen. What is the nature of nature is to some degree the question that Marvell is asking. And the problem is that they see it for their own purposes. They see it as a human-centered, as an aspect of their own accomplishments. And they don't see its purposes there ultimately, which is for God's glory. That is never a thought that enters their mind. In the same way, this poem, The Mower Against Gardens, and let me share my screen with you here, and I'll read it. In the same way, The Mower Against Gardens levies the same sort of critique. So let me begin. Luxurious man, to bring his vice in use, did after him the world seduce. And from the fields the flowers and plants allure, where nature was most plain and pure. He first enclosed within the garden's square a dead and standing pool of air, and a more luscious earth for them did need, which stupefied them while it fed. The pink grew then as double as his mind, the nutriment did change the kind. With strange perfumes he did the roses taint, and flowers themselves were taught to paint. The tulip, white, did for complexion seek and learn to interline its cheek. Its onion root they then so high did hold that one was for a meadow sold. Another world was searched through oceans new to find the marvel of Peru. And yet these rarities might be allowed to man, that sovereign thing and proud, had he not dealt between the bark and tree, forbidden mixtures there to see. No plant now knew the stalk from which it came, he grafts upon the wild the tame, that the uncertain and adulterate fruit might put the palate in dispute. His green seraglio has its eunuchs too, lest any tyrant him outdo. And in the cherry he does nature vex to procreate without a sex. 'Tis all enforced, the fountain and the grot, while the sweet fields do lie forgot, where willing nature does to all dispense a wild and fragrant innocence. And fauns and fairies do the meadows till, more by their presence than their skill. Their statues, polished by some ancient hand, may to adorn the gardens stand. But howsoe'er the figures do excel, the gods themselves with us do dwell. So this magnificent poem is inveighing against, I submit, a variety of misuses of nature, which simply are to be attributed to human sin, which it makes clear from the very get-go. The very first line, luxurious man to bring his vice in use, did after him the world seduce. So now we're not dealing with original sin. We're dealing with the application of sin, the continuation of sin, specifically in relation to our interaction with the garden. And rather than being stewards of gardens and utilizing gardens and giving God glory in the gardens and using the earth for the purposes for which God designed it, we are taking, as it were, a mower to it. And the mower here is not in reference in the title to the implement, the mower, but rather the person doing the mowing. But of course, the person doing the mowing has a mower. And so he's cutting it, the grass, so that it is rather clean and uniform. And that serves his purposes for and such forth, so that the green of the grass is now manicured and looks very splendid, much like a soccer pitches these days, very flatter than a carpet, and in some ways easier to step on. It's extraordinary the degree to which we can now make nature appear to be a surface on which there is no unevenness, and there's an expression of domination there. This is expressed throughout Marvell's poem here. And he talks about this in various metaphors. Note that again, he uses the rhyming couplets, which we noted earlier in the poem, The Garden, as well. But he talks about different forms of this. So he talks about he enclosed within the garden square a dead and standing pool of air. So there symbols of sterility and also stagnancy there, and a much more luscious earth for them to read, so that the tread need which stupefied them while it fed. So the exploitation of nature to get more product out of it, more agricultural product, to intensify farming and so forth, and the technologies that were used for this. Now, it's often been noted in recent times by theologians that what happens from this period onwards, and that by this period, it is roughly the age of modern science and Baconian science, that there is a desecration of the earth, or rather than a desecration, because that would suggest that nature is sacred, and there's no such belief there, but rather that it has an inherent dignity which needs to be respected. And that goes with the idea of being a steward of the earth. Note that we're not the kings of the earth. We don't, let alone the creators. The word creator is not used in Christian writers of authors or so forth. That's a prerogative that's used of God alone, the creator. Likewise of the poet, the same sort of sensibility of not making a confusion of categories between human creativity and divine creativity. In the same way that we see in this period, this strong critique of the mixing of categories. It's not quite the Levitical objection that you aren't supposed to mix different fibers and so forth, but it is in that vein of thinking that there are boundaries in nature which it is wrong to transgress, not even for the purposes of bringing about greater apparent flourishing without causing also desecration. And Marvell's poem is littered with illustrations of this. So the pink then grew then as double as his mind. This is a reference, explicit reference to Bacon's work on gardens, in which he talks about the ability to double productivity and the yield of fruit and of flowers and so forth through modern agricultural means, and he advocates for it very strongly. Bacon was himself a gardener, and he was a gardener of a very specific type, which we now recognize as pretty much ubiquitous, the type that wants to yield greater and greater yields, and he does so by mixing and matching things. And there's an illustration there which Marvell does not make here, but which is I'm mindful of. In 1634, there was something called a tulip mania in Holland, when the price of tulips reached such extraordinarily high levels that the tulip was used as a means of currency. And it was the first speculative bubble in history, really, at a time when you could buy basically, I think one bulb was used to buy 12 acres of property. That's how valuable a tulip was. So this is an inflated asset. And of course, eventually it it popped. So I've got here just on Wikipedia, at the height of tulip mania in February 1637, some single tulip bulbs sold for more than 10 times the annual income of a skilled artisan. And so again, there's a sense of exploiting nature in order to gain benefit and gain material wealth, but at the cost of any sense of the that something's being lost in the process. And that is really what I think Marvell is exploring here in his garden poems. Now, the first in the sequence, the Mower against gardens, is the opening gambit in that whole sequence. So it's about a mower's condemnation of the accumulation of knowledge and profit that comes from exploiting nature, which is the explicit aim of Baconian science. And he cites in it a spiritual sin, and he's aware, as we are becoming increasingly aware, that technology and technological advances are not neutral, and they've been used to spread the manipulation to other worlds as well, which again are alluded to in the poem. So let me put this back on the shared screen here, because it's rather interesting. Remember, we talked about context here. Well, the discovery of the new world and its exploitation is certainly on one of the topics of this period. So he notes that its onion root they then did so high did hold that one for a meadow sold. Sounds like the tulip mania. Another world was searched through oceans new to find the marvel of Peru. I suspect that's the potato. And yet these rarities might be allowed to man, that sovereign thing and proud, had he not dealt between the bark and the tree. So again, it's not that it's not the dominion over nature that is being objected to. It's the fact that there is a violation. It's held to be no integrity within the natural order whatsoever. He comes between the bark and the tree is the metaphor for this. Forbidden mixtures there to see. No plant now knew the stalk from which it came. He grafts upon the wild, the tame, that the uncertain and adulterate fruit might put the palate in dispute. His green seraglio has its eunuchs too, lest any tyrant him outdo. A seraglio, by the way, is a term that is used, was used of the Ottoman Empire. It is a sequestered living quarters for the wives and concubines in an Ottoman household. It's the domestic space in which only women are. Women and, of course, eunuchs are the only ones allowed around this harem. So it's within the palace of an Ottoman sultan that is meant. And in the cherry, he does nature vex to procreate without a sex. Now, this is again what Bacon is advocating for in order to increase productivity. We don't actually need to use seeds anymore. We can simply use other means. So all these are accumulations in these rhyming cups of ways in which nature is being misused by science. And so we see in this sequence a critique of the way in which nature is being approached by his contemporaries. Now, this is a different, I'd say a different angle on which to see this course. We did look at Bacon at the outset, and I talked about the Baconian view of science and the Baconian method, which becomes increasingly dominant to this day, that science is almost inextricably linked, not with the discovery of truth, but with the exploitation of nature to gain technological progress, but also material wealth. And the objections that are raised in our day against this begin, I think, in many ways with Andrew Marvell. So with that said, let me now move to the second. And with the second, it's the fourth in the sequence of Mower poems. And it concludes it. And it's very much distinct from the others, but it to some degree encapsulates the growing alienation that takes place between the mower and the garden, and as it turns out, a woman by the name of Juliana. let me look at that. Just to encapsulate the poems that I'm not looking at. In the second installment, Damon the mower turns away from the issues of the world and begins lamenting his own situation. And he introduces Juliana in that poem. And this is a woman that he's in love with, and she rejects him. And that brings about ultimately his demise. And there's scorching heats, they wither everything, etc. And the only thing left is the withered self of himself. And the heat comes from Juliana's contempt for him. Now we can see in Juliana and perhaps Damon an Adamic figure of Adam and a figure of Eve. Here, Eve, in the figure of Juliana, withering him with her contempt for his exploitation of the garden. In the third poem, just to summarize, the mower to the glowworms, we see the immanence of God in creation, and how it works in the process of the mower's fall. Very explicitly, the mowers, or rather the glowworms, are symbols that ought to be guiding the mower from his path, and then he ignores the glowworms and their goodness. And you might want to see an analogies for this in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner with the snakes in the water snakes, which he at first curses, and then later when he repents, he blesses unaware. In this case, the mower believes he's too far gone to repent or change, and so he can't part from his path, and so he's now left in the position where we pick it up, which is in this poem, The Mower's Song. Let me put that up on the screen for you. I'll share the screen and then I'll read it and then we'll go on. Now, what we see in this poem, in terms of its form, is a return to the form of the Elizabethan period, which was very much in keeping with the idea that nature is something that reflects God's glory and something that very much fits within the pastoral genre, but seeing it from a Christian perspective. As I say, Bacon comes after that. And now, so we can see a divergence between the 16th century and its understanding of the creation as a reflection of God's glory, and the 17th century, where we start to see a split taking place. Modern science is coming in. There are different views of what mankind is. Come Descartes, there's a different view of the attitudes of mankind towards nature, which we see in Bacon's work. And again, in the Royal Society, we see the Bacon's methodology being implemented on a significant level as a mass project of the gentleman scientists of the period. But let me read the Mower's Song. And this is, again, at the tail end of this all, and this is the terrible outcome of the mower's refusal to repent. The Mower's Song, it's what it's called. My mind was once the true survey of all these meadows fresh and gay, and in the greenness of the grass did see its hopes as in a glass. When Juliana came, and she, what I do to the grass, does to my thoughts and me. But these, while I with sorrow pine, grew more luxuriant still and fine, that not one blade of grass you spied, but had a flower on either side. When Juliana came, and she, what I do to the grass, does to my thoughts and me. Unthankful meadows, could you so a fellowship so true forego, and in your gaudy May games meet, while I lay trodden under feet? When Juliana came, and she, what I do to the grass, does to my thoughts and me. But what you in compassion ought, shall now by my revenge be wrought, and flowers and grass and I and all will in one common ruin fall. For Juliana comes, and she, what I do to the grass, does to my thoughts and me. And thus, ye meadows, which have been companions of my thoughts, more green, shall now the heraldry become with which I shall adorn my tomb. For Juliana comes, and she, what I do to the grass, does to my thoughts and me. So we see in the 5 stanzas here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a significant parallelism with some divergence, but the final two lines of each of the 5 stanzas, note there's 6-line rhyming couplets, but the final line is a longer line, but each of the final 2 couplets, or the final couplet in each of these stanzas, is the same, at least with one difference. The first three stanzas, when Juliana came, and the 4th and 5th state that for Juliana came. So there's a little shift there. And of course, rather than him killing the world and regarding it as a slave and seeing it with scorn and contempt, although he once did the true survey of all these meadows fresh and gay, and saw in the greenness of the grass, did see its hopes as in a glass. So he had utopian aims, he had idealistic aims, he had aims of doing good things. He ended up not doing good things. That's what the Mower poems depict throughout. He alienated himself from the world by seeing it in instrumental terms. And as a consequence, the woman for who should be his mate, should be his complement, who should be his Eve if he is the Adam, has nothing but withering contempt for him. She will have nothing to do with him. And so he uses, interestingly, the pastoral genre, which is usually there to exalt romantic love and which celebrates romantic love. In this case, it leads to the lover, Juliana, rejecting Damon, who would love her, but she will not reciprocate because his view of the natural world is so contemptible and so vicious and so sinful that she has nothing to do with him. And so he addresses the topics that I said we could see back in the garden, in which we see symbols of being and symbols of goodness and symbols of flourishing in the proper understanding of the garden, ultimately leading to love and reflecting the love of God. But when they're misused and misapplied, they lead to the outcome that we read about here in the Mower song. That although he began with in the greenness of the grass, seeing his hopes as in a glass, now he's in the state, but these while I with sorrow pine, grow more luxuriant still and fine, that not one blade of grass you spied, but had a flower on either side. But when Juliana came and she do what I do, the grass does to my thoughts and me. So what's interesting is that the natural order, which he is treated without any regard for the creator's intentions, has been abused. It nonetheless flourishes. But he finds that in the human world, in the human order, there is no such resiliency. There will be sterility between the relationship between Juliana and Damon because of his sinful attitude. So there's a breach in the human family here between the woman and the man, to the point where, as what he did to the grass, she does to my thoughts and me. She is a powerful critic and destroys his godless attitudes here. And he upbraids the meadows for their action, for not going down with him. And he uses the metaphor of being trodden under feet in the 3rd stanza. Very interesting, because it's probably a reference to salt and light. Remember that Jesus uses the metaphor that Christians are to be as salt and light, and if the salt loses its saltiness, what good is it but to be trodden under feet? Well, this is a man who has lost his saltiness. The salt there, which is to preserve the earth, to give it its flavor, to bring out its essence and its goodness, has so regarded the earth as a sterile instrumental thing that now there's nothing left of him but to be trodden under feet, and specifically under the feet of Juliana. And that leads to the final turn in the last 2 stanzas, that a common ruin results, and he ends up using these flowers, which he never considered the purpose or ends of, to be garlands that will be heralds, as it were, to adorn his tomb. So it's a very bleak ending to a fascinating series of poems that are all dealing with a certain view of nature. I think it's very interesting to read Marvell's take on this, and particularly to read it as alongside the Romantics' critique of what's being done to the natural world. And that continues into the Industrial Revolution and to this day in the critique of transhumanism and posthumanism, in the way in which the biological order of things that God has set up in place are being exploited and misused, allegedly for the benefit of mankind, but in fact leading to greater enmity. And that's because of the sin of pride and the disregard for the original design of the created order. But that'll be it for my look at the Mower poems. Again, there are 4 in the sequence. I looked at 2 of them, but the first and the last, and you can look at the others. But they are all of a piece, and I think they speak to the same sort of concerns here. They make Marvell a splendid pastoral poet, but also an extraordinary addition to the series of 3 metaphysical poets we've looked at. So that's it for now.